Dr.
Here we
Goodwin,
are.
here we go. Beowulf Part 3.
Beowulf Part 3. Well, we ended up last time with the battle, Grendel and Beowulf duking it out. So then in the next section, all right, we're going to get into a lot today. We've got Grendel's mother, but it would be a mistake to think of this section of the poem as just a battle between him and his mother, because the poet explores so much stuff using this narrative. It's fascinating. Before I dive into it, though, I wanted your thoughts on this section of the poem. What's going on for you?
Well, I know we ended our last conversation, and for me, if we're thinking about it in terms of this being the ego, right? I really thought that Grendel would pretty much represent not a superficial complex, but something that was represented represents something much deeper, being Grendel's mother, and that being essentially she playing the role of a mother complex. This narrative, if we were going to kind of digest it in terms of psychodynamics, yeah, that's kind of where I was coming at it.
Yeah, I think that's right, because we always have to remember that when we're dealing with symbols like this, the mother is not the mother. The mother is something larger that the psyche is using a mother to represent. So in this case, we have a fatherless being in Grendel. But what does that represent psychologically? It's not a cut against mothers. It's not a dig at parents. It's about, what does the mother represent? Our mother represents our origin, our physicality. We literally come from the bodies of our mothers. So that's a pretty darn good symbol for origins, right?
Yeah.
And so it's that nascent substance from which we emerge. In fact, I've heard it poetically put as that nature doesn't act like a mother, that mothers act like nature. And I like the way that they play with the symbols there. But then what does the father? So the father often then would represent the wider social context. When the journey goes from mother to father for men or women, they're journeying from the origin as an animal, with all of these instinctive processes, into how do I adjust into a wider social context? And we need the social context in order to help us figure out how that is accomplished and so forth. And so that gets represented as fathers a lot of times. Not that mothers can't, like literal mothers, of course, can do all of this stuff, and they're fantastic at it. And literal fathers can be mothering type figures as well. So it's just, what is the symbolism about? In this case, Grendel doesn't have that piece. And Beowulf didn't either, but he found it.
Yeah.
For his own hard work. And that was the key difference between the two of them. So yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. So what happens next is the Shop, which is the poet, kind of in Norwegian or like the Viking culture, we call him a skald, or in Celtic it might be a bard. Sings his praise. He sings the praise of Beowulf right alongside his story that he gives about two other characters. On one hand, he talks about Siegmund, who is a dragon slayer of great note. And this other guy named Heremod, who was a king who ran amok and didn't cause anything but a strife for his kingdom. So this is a great example of that, a positive style that I was talking about last time, where the poets in Old English poetry would say, here's this story, here's this story, here's this story, and just leave it and let you figure out what the contrast is all about. It's very understated, but that's an undercurrent of all this poetry. Understatement is always there. Here's a great example of some of this understatement. Is he says, the poet says, Unferth, remember Unferth, of course, he was more silent when Beowulf came back. What a great way to put that. And not, he shut his stupid ass up.
Right.
No, Unferth was then more silent. So it says a lot without saying very much at all. It's a great characteristic of this poetry. Anyway, so the poet is talking about a poet telling the story of Siegmund and Beowulf and Heremod. And you can see the contrast almost immediately, right? We have this great, almost mythic level, legendary hero of Siegmund, who killed the dragon and all that stuff. And Heremod, who's like, whatever, here is this guy, you don't want to be that guy. And then here's Beowulf. And so in achieving this great victory, he throws this out there and says, now you're a part of this pantheon of archetypal type of characters, And so it's a very resounding sort of victory. And then, so Hrothgar says, thanks be to God that this victory was achieved. And then he says, and Beowulf, make sure you don't, succumb to the temptation of overweening pride. Kind of a strange offhand way of saying thanks, for all your help.
Right.
Yeah. It's great that you killed Grendel and all, and thank God for that, right? And Beowulf's like, bruh, but that's how it was done, right? He's got to save face. He's the king, right? He can't really say what probably should have been said in other contexts, which would have been, thank you for doing this, because then it diminishes him somewhat, right? And the modern eye that looks back at this and say, these guys, they're so puffed up with their egos and they're so narcissistic. Well, we'll get into more of this later, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple, because their context demanded that they be fierce defenders of their standing and their reputation. We'll get into why that is, but anyway, so Beowulf then retells this story of what he did. Right, we just saw him do it, and now he's going to tell the other guys in there what he did. Now, some commentators on the poem have said, "Well, this is so weird; it's so redundant. Why we just saw him do this? Why is he telling us again?" But I think there's a strong purpose. But I wanted your thoughts on that. Why is he doing that? Do you think?
So why is Hrothgar, or why is Beowulf told not to kind of go about this and taking too much pride in what he's
Well, it's not that question. Is why is Beowulf telling everyone in the hall what we just saw him do? Like, they were all there. And he says, and let me tell you how the battle went. Right? It just seems kind of bizarre, right? But again, psychologically, it makes sense. I was wondering if you had thoughts about why.
I see it as if it's almost like an external vocalization of certain internal processes that might happen for an individual to kind of, it almost like externally solidifies, like in that voice is action, right? So if somebody has really integrated something or moved past a maladaptive complex, to be able to like say it and speak it in truth, that's huge. That goes a long way. Yeah. So that's how I kind of see it.
I'm right there with you. I think that's why. And it's the poet is showing us the power of retelling our tale. When I was dealing with a lot of when I was in the Air Force and I saw a lot of war veterans, obviously there was a lot of interest in PTSD and how to help that. And there's a number of different studies looking into what are the predictive factors. And there's three main factors that go into likelihood of developing PTSD. And the number one is, of course, the severity of the trauma, which is understandable. That doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. And then the other two are really interesting. The other two are whether or not you share your story with anyone else or keep it secret. And, or if you do share it, do you feel rejected by those listening to your story? So, and a whole host of other things didn't seem to matter as much as that. And so what that told me when I was reading those studies was this business that Beowulf goes through of retelling the story of what he just did is a psychologically important process that we need to not dismiss or overlook. And that's what happens, of course, in therapy is they have to tell us their story. And of course, it's important not to for them to experience rejection from us and telling us that. Hopefully you wouldn't do that. But here's why, because that just makes it worse. So it's this business of storytelling that is so powerful. And like you said, it's a verbal act. It's almost magical act of creation. In telling the story, you craft a reality based around what happened to you. It's memory consolidation, if you will. So, yeah. So then the poet goes from that to, and the poet does this all the time. He'll describe something, and then he'll reflect on it, and then he'll kind of abstract out into grand gnomic statements of, great wisdom. Like going up in the levels of like, and this is what this means, and this is what he does here. He says, Grendel would have killed more had not wise God and Beowulf's courage, always both, changed that fate. The Lord then ruled all the race of men as he still does now. Therefore, says the poet, understanding is best, the spirit's forethought, because much love and much hate must we endure. Who thinks to live long here in this world in these days of strife? One of my favorite passages in the poem, because it's just so true, and it's profound, because it's saying, well, let me share, or let me pause here. What does that statement mean to you? What does that passage mean to you?
Well, I feel like it's reiterating the fact that it's not just there's something more at play than just a kind of cognitive willing, right, of action, right? There's that humbling, right? So it's equally identifying that Beowulf's actions are his, but that thing that is transpersonal, right?
Yeah.
But also identifying it as that in the future, this is something that is present as well for all men, right? For all of mankind.
Right.
So I don't think it's coincidental that Beowulf was compared to those heroes prior, right?
Right.
In terms of him becoming, embodying this archetypal image, right? Or him becoming a through line of something that is archetypal, but then also identifying that thing that is transpersonal is going to act within each of us that could be considered socially what would be considered archetypal, right?
Yeah.
In terms of its expression. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It makes the statement of understanding is best. You wouldn't think necessarily that would be the thing that he says is the most important, but for the poet, it is. And many commentators have talked about this poem reflect on the fact that it seems that whoever this poet was, he was probably not a young man. He was probably someone who had seen some stuff and had some earned wisdom about him, because that's because that comes through in the poem, and this stuff that he does, like makes these little sides about this is what is true about the world. Much what must we endure. If we live long enough, we're going to see all the ups and downs, and understanding is how we get through that. That carries a lot of gold for me. And it's like, no matter what you think is going to happen, something that you couldn't possibly foresee is going to happen. But if you go into it with this attitude, you'll be ready.
Yeah.
You'll be ready. So then after this, Wealhtheow shows up. This would be Hrothgar's queen. And she is a peace weaver. She's praised as a great, wise peace weaver. So we got to do a little bit of an aside here in the role of women in ancient Anglo-Saxon culture, because there's a lot of ink spilled over this subject when you get to talk about Beowulf. And you have, on one hand, you've got a number of commentators who I think are really just looking at the poem through modern lenses, because they see all of this oppression and women are in pitiful state and they're powerless and victims and all this kind of stuff. But then there's other scholars on the other side of this who say, yeah, that doesn't really match what the data has shown us in terms of the actual historical record and the poems themselves, like the Icelandic sagas and all this. So if you dive into this part in particular, even with one of the books that I read was looking at Beowulf from a Jungian lens, like I was doing, and brought in this stuff about the anima and the feminine and all that kind of stuff, and how it's portrayed in the poem. And a lot of times modern commentators like to talk about the warrior culture and how toxic it was, and it's, you know, the men have to be fierce and the women have to be peace weavers and all that kind of thing. And I think a lot of it is oversimplified, and it's a little bit condescending too, I think.
Yeah.
They lived the way they did because that was the way life was, and what, for better or for worse, the warrior culture and the emphasis on saving face and all that kind of stuff that was so prominent amongst men was there for a reason. Because if you didn't do that, then you would be sending a message out to everyone that you were weak and ready to be stomped and taken all your stuff, right? There was no executive branch to take care of things, you know. So in that context, then, men needed to be, especially the warriors, older men could get away with not being quite so ferociously strong all the time, and I'm sure it was exhausting for some of them. But they tended to need it to be that way, but that meant that women could advocate for more peaceful solutions to things without it seeming like a show of weakness. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why I think queens were often praised for being intelligent weavers of peace to keep the revenge cycles and the mayhem to a minimum.
Yeah.
Which there was plenty of that, you know, because that's how it was. So Whaleveil is shown as an expert in this, and she comes in and she says, because there's this tension immediately happening here when Beowulf comes back victorious. What do you think is a potential problem that might occur in that moment?
I have ideas.
Okay.
Well,
what do you think?
Well, sexual advantage, right? This is a young warrior, right? That just achieved something great. I think that that immediately presents potential competition, right? But I mean, if I'm thinking about this in terms of the overall psyche, I mean, if this is a revivification of the ego, right, in terms of a new adaptation, an integration with a complex, so to speak, there should be some level of reinstitution right there, and that could I mean the leveling out of that can be tumultuous, to say the very least, because it's almost like this catharsis, right?
Yeah.
But if we're speaking just solely in terms of culture, in terms of what that culture meant, I would say that sexual competitiveness plays a huge role. He just won. It's this massive victory. Nobody else can do that. I'm sure every woman that Hrothgar was king of was swooning over him.
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I imagine so. Yep. Right. But what I was thinking is when he comes in, there's this potential for, okay, Beowulf just accomplished this thing that you guys couldn't. Mm-hmm. It might mean that Beowulf is still, at the end of the day, from a different clan. He is a Geat, and he's not a Dane. So Whaleveil, I think, so Hrothgar addresses some of this by downplaying Beowulf's part in the victory. Right. Immediately he starts saying, thanks be to God, right? And who can argue with that? Nobody. So that's a canny way of doing that. So there's all this power dynamic is going on after he comes home from this victory. Now, psychologically, I see that as a reflection of the tendency that we might get towards ego inflation. If we resolve this conflict, we might get overconfident. We might overstep our bounds and start thinking. And so bringing in thanks be to God too is also really helpful there, because like, okay, let's contain this. Mm-hmm. And he's probably got a rush of energy, like victory. But then in the social sphere here, there's a potential for a big problem. If Beowulf suddenly says, I'm taking over here because I'm the winner. I just took, he's got his retainers with him and everything. He could have just, So she's immediately coming in and trying to nip that in the bud in a very subtle and intelligent and cunning sort of way. She says, she strides forth and she's laid out in gold, and she's got this, this cup that there's a ceremonial factor here where it was expected that the greatest warrior of the hall gets the cup first from the queen, right? So signifying her approval of whoever is in charge. And of course it goes to Hrothgar first, reestablishing the validity of the old way of doing things. It's not let's throw the baby out with the bathwater and just lead to total chaos.
Right.
All right, let's try to navigate this transition with some stability. Right? So she does this, and then she goes, I've been told that you would have this warrior. She's talking to Hrothgar here. I've been told you would have this warrior, meaning Beowulf, for your son, because he says stuff like, it's as if my son, blah, blah, blah. And she says, Herod is cleansed, bright hall of rings, use while you may your gifts from so many, and leave your kinsmen, the nation and the folk. Okay, so in other words, we won. Give this man the gifts that he is due for being a mighty warrior, and make sure you leave everything to your sons, i.e. my sons. Yeah. Where it's supposed to go, right? It's funny that she says and here and not but, because I think anyone lesser would have said but. Give this guy stuff, but make sure you keep our stuff here. But she doesn't say that. She says and. It's very precise wording here, and it's not a translation. It's a literal translation in this one word. So it's a way that she can say, hey, dude, don't get too carried away with Beowulf. Remember, we got a kingdom to run here. Now that Grendel's gone, we might be able to do that. So but it's a way that she can say it without insulting anybody. That's what the Peace Weaver thing is about.
I'm wondering to what degree this is also potentially representative, almost like the positive anima, right?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yes. So like it's a recognition of correct action, right?
Yes.
The relating, but then also a wanting to pull back of any type of inflation.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely. And the way that the thing that's so bizarre and amazing about Beowulf is that the characters at this stage of the story are like several different versions of the anima, how the anima can appear. There's a positive one, there's a destructive one, there's a vengeful one, there's all of this stuff. Like Grendels Mother is in here as one of pure destruction, and what to do about that one, and so forth. And these sidebars that are in here that have frustrated commentators over the years, more of the earlier commentators on Beowulf rather than the later ones, used to get very frustrated by the poet's tendency to stop talking about what Beowulf was doing and then go off on this tangent about what someone else is doing, like this Hildebert episode and the Finn raid and all that kind of stuff. But later commentators have noticed that there was a reason for this, and it was just that understated appositive style that they were using. And it was the reason for showing this other story was to say this is the flip side of what just happened. But he doesn't beat you over the head with it. He doesn't spoon feed you that. You have to, think of it, and then you start being, oh, okay, yeah. So right as we've seen how a masterful peace weaver and positive anima figure behaves, Grendel's mother shows up. So it's like point, counterpoint, and the poet does this throughout the entire poem, over and over and over again. But I did want to mention briefly that the peace weaver figure in the culture, though it is a great symbol of the positive anima, it emerged because of the necessity of the role in the culture. Right. Sensitivity to insult was a major issue for those folks. Why do you think that is?
Sensitivity to insult. I mean, well, if you don't kind of own up to or meet the challenge of insult, right, you're going to be perceived as weak. Exactly,
and then you're going to get mowed down.
Yeah,
because again, there's no executive branch in this society. There's no calling the cops. Now, you can argue that that's great, and then some people might argue that it's not great, because it means that, on the positive side, it means you don't have people taking the law in their own hands. You don't have revenge killings and cycles of endless violence and all that, and endless feuds. But instead, it means that if someone is attacking you, you have to not do anything except report it to the authorities and then let them handle it. And emotionally, that is something that's difficult to do.
Yep.
I'm sure you've had clients and I've had patients that have had horrible things happen to them, and much of their strife is waiting for the legal system to catch up with what was done to them.
Yeah.
And if justice is served, a lot of times their emotions are served.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important thing.
Yeah.
And that's because rage is there to defend us.
Yeah.
If we don't feel defended, we're still angry about it.
Well, it's just like with the entirety of this poem, having an appreciation for the times, right, and the nuance there, and like not really just solely looking at it through a modern lens. I think understanding a culture that was based on kind of this I wouldn't say strictly pride, but it was in terms of a culture on the spectrum getting a little bit more primitive. It is definitely there. There might have been more instinctual expression to a certain degree in terms of being able to meet that challenge. And I think you're right. When there is sufficient law enforcement and you do feel like there's fulfillment of justice in a way, and I don't mean in terms of a legal sense, but instinctual justice, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Then that feels right. It feels complete. There's fulfillment. And I think you have to strike a balance between those two to a certain extent, right? Society has to bring, if there is more safety in society has to bring more of a externalization of fulfillment instead of an individual sole responsibility to do so.
Right.
Yeah.
I think if you're comparing like different subsistence methods and cultures throughout the ages, foragers over the ages in different areas of the world engaged in warfare, and animals engaged in warfare,
mm-hmm.
territorial warfare, not to the extent that we do, but if you look at the kind of culture that the Anglo-Saxons lived in, it was a pastoral culture, and there was a lot of raiding and stuff because the wealth was tied up in the livestock.
Mm-hmm.
So unlike a agricultural society, which could just, build a big wall around the fields, you had pastures and they were mobile, and someone could, it's hard to go in and steal somebody's crops and then run off with them, You can do it, I guess, but they can just grow more. If you steal somebody's cows, then they're your cows, right? You get all the wealth that goes with them. So yeah, they were pretty feisty about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because the ones that weren't feisty got weeded out a long time ago. So only the ones that were left were the ferocious ones. So that was how they survived. But of course, that type of society means that you're prone to these cycles of violence. One of the ways that they tried to deal with this was peace weavers, but other ways were things like weregild, which is, say you kill one of my family members, everyone in the area has sort of agreed that if I pay you X amount of gold, then we're good. And that's that. Sometimes that satisfied and sometimes it didn't. So that was another way that they tried to mitigate the endless mayhem. And that's why the poet is also very much, he meditates frequently on frivolous raiding and how that leads to death and destruction. Because people were not stupid. They could see that oftentimes would lead to destruction. So Heremode and the later characters that Beowulf is compared to when he's king. And of course, Beowulf is shown to be the guy who doesn't do that stuff and only fights when it's necessary and all that. So anyway, so yeah. So if you get into the scholarship of Beowulf, you will sometimes run into this stuff about analyzing how women were in society and all that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll see depictions or interpretations that say that women were very weak in that society and they were oppressed and so forth. But the the actual stories tell a different tale. And that, yeah, there weren't a whole lot of female warriors. There's probably more than we think there were, but as far as like recent archaeological digs seem to show that, but there still wasn't like really widespread, but that doesn't mean that they were powerless. They often had a role in society where they were called wetters or goaders. And you see this in the sagas, where it's not that they would run out and get revenge, but they would poke at the men and say, hey, aren't you going to go out there and get revenge? Mm-hmm. Hey, man, you better man up, right? They use that. And they could be just as bloodthirsty. Sometimes the men were like, oh man, do I really have to? You know, and they're like, yes, you need to go out there and kill those guys. You know, I need to demand justice, you know. And then of course, in some cases, like the story of Freydis, Eric's daughter, she went out and took care of business herself with a sword and just, you know, slaughtered everybody. She's definitely not somebody to mess with. So I'm beating this to death because when Grendel's mother shows up, the interpretations of her are often of this character where they're saying that she is monstrous because she's doing stuff that women are not supposed to do in her world. She's claiming revenge for the death of her son, and that was frowned upon, and that's why she's so monstrous. Bullcrap. There was no problem in ancient society, Anglo-Saxon society, with women taking vengeance or convincing other people to take vengeance. They were expected to do that. She's monstrous because of how she attacks and who she attacks, and the fact that she's of, you know, the race of Cain and all of that sort of stuff. Has nothing to do with subverting, you know, the expectations of good and proper feminine behavior. That's projecting like Victorian values onto 9th century Anglo-Saxon women who probably would have laughed in your face if you tried to tell them that stuff. You're like, get out of here.
Right. Yeah.
There's, you know, sagas where, in fact, they had this great way of describing things in the sagas and in the poems. In the sagas, and I'm talking about Icelandic sagas here when I say that, as part of a reflection of general Germanic, early medieval Germanic society. There's a lot of parallels between them and the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic tribe. Mm-hmm. So in Norse, anyway, they had two terms, fatr and bladr, which means soft and hard. And you could get that regardless of your gender. Mm-hmm. More often than not, men were seen as fatr and women as bladr, which would be soft. But sometimes it got mixed around depending on which person you're talking about. Like, and if a woman is regarded as fatr, then you're free and clear to beat the crap out of her if you can. You might not be able to, right? She might kick your butt. That's how it was used at the terminology, right? So it's a nice, subtle nuance that we don't seem to have in our society, in our language anyway. But this was centuries and centuries and centuries ago. So again, it's proof that the ancients were every bit as sophisticated as we are. And sometimes they saw things that we didn't see and that we don't see.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to project our modern, gender politics onto 9th century sources and see things that weren't really there.
Yeah. Well, I think with Grendel's mother, it's the rage and the kind of instinctual want for revenge is absolutely normal, regardless of if you're a man or a woman. I think it's in the means of expression. And then what qualifies it within the story as being quote unquote monstrous or evil is, and I think that if you take the story as is that what it is, it's a myth, it's a narrative. You don't necessarily have to then just project that. If you interject that and then project that in the environment and say, okay, this is what exactly it is, right? You take it as a tale that is really trying to be an exemplar of something that could be a potentially instinctually significant and then socially archetypal, right? Grendel's mother, those instincts were completely normal, right? It's the expression, it's how she goes about it. And that's what qualifies them as evil, i.e. then catabolic and self-destructive. Needless destruction.
I'm just, and so I don't buy into the idea that she's considered monstrous by the Anglo-Saxons because she subverts feminine roles.
Right.
I mean, but I've seen ridiculous interpretations like that, and other ones like that she's a parody of the Virgin Mary, that she is seen as negative because she takes forbidden vengeance. None of that makes any sense in comparison to what we know about the ancient Germanic tribes.
I would say that those that do probably are looking at it through a lens of a complex instead of really trying to understand what it actually is.
Yeah, and they're looking at it through our own modern gender politics problems, right? And where women really were seen as inferior and really were oppressed for a long time. And they had this idea, I guess, that it's just been that way since time immemorial, but no, that's not the case. The further you go back far enough, you'll see plenty of it, right? In the 18th century and so forth, and the Victorian era and all that kind of thing. I mean, just keep going back further and further and further, but eventually it starts to get more egalitarian when you start getting back into this time frame and deeper back. But no, women were not seen as inferior. So that gets us to the Anima. And before I say what I think the Anima is, let me hear your description of what is the Anima. The elusive figure.
the relating function, just like I try not to. I think in terms of Jungian, right, and understanding the way he split it up in terms of positive, negative makes sense in terms of his psychology, what he was going through himself and his own personal experience. So I tend not to polarize it as such. I think it can appear as positive or it can appear as negative. But really it's on whole the relating function. And in terms of the poem itself, again, for the poem itself, where we're trying to kind of designate what's going on, if there would be a representation of the negative Anima potentially coming through a mother complex and then coming through Grendel, right, in terms of that more superficial complex in terms of relating, then you could probably qualify Grendel's mother as the negative Anima.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think she represents a negative type of Anima figure. But in general, the Anima is not good or bad. It involves that which draws us out into the unknown, out of our comfort zone. Right? We've talked a little bit about this. Something about life experience triggers an emotion that pulls you into adventure and or danger on the promise of bliss. That's the Anima. So again, it is depicted, and again, I always try to differentiate between the thing and the thing it is representing, right? The map is not the territory. So if you have a masculine ego, and what's a perfect picture of something that's going to draw your attention if you're a straight guy, right? A beautiful woman. But it's not about women. It's about drawing. It's that more general process that gets depicted as that in you, right? And so when I'm treating folks that are LGBTQ plus, et cetera, I have to take that into account. Like if they're attracted to the same sex, then their Anima, if it's a man, can be a male. And it often is. But the process is what's universal, not so much the image, right? The image is what works for you. Right? That's what draws you out. So in this case, it is a feminine figure. And in general, the Anima is about seeking and sexuality and attachment, all wrapped up into one very powerful symbol. And that's the thing that draws us out of our comfort zone into whatever. And again, it's all based on the instincts and what worked, right? Being exploratory, seeking out new things, and going forth and exploring what else might be out there. That's going to be, things like Anima figures will do that. So in this case, though, she does exactly that, but based on fear and terror tactics. Beowulf has to leave to go find out, more about this figure. Because unlike Grendel, she knows what she's up against. This is the thing that makes her so much more dangerous. If you remember, Grendel sort of trundled along thinking he was going to win until he ran smack into Beowulf, and all of a sudden he's like, holy crap, now what do I do?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Grendel's mother is not like that. She's way smarter. She comes in, she's cagey, and the poet deliberately refers to her as not as strong as Grendel, interestingly enough. And yes, she's more dangerous, right? So the poet knows that there's more kinds of danger than just brute strength. And brute strength's not going to beat Beowulf. That's what he's built for. See? So she comes in and she's cagey, right? She forces Beowulf and other people to play by her rules. She shows up and she doesn't just kill a random dude. She kills Hrothgar's best friend, Ashura. And it devastates him. And I'm like, yeah, that's the Anima. That's the Anima doing that. It's going to hit you right where it hurts. If it's negative, it's coming at you, the ego from out of nowhere, it's going to stab you right in the heart. Precise. Not like Grendel, who just comes in raging. See? So it's different from that complex. It's deeper. The ego is less able to just push it around.
Yeah.
And in this case, not because it's just brute strength, but because you don't know where she is. She just comes out of nowhere. She's completely unexpected. So now the poet says here, as well, let me back up a second. Let's talk about her morality a little bit. All right, we talked a little bit about this. So Grendel is seen as essentially based in resentment and anger and all that kind of stuff. But the poet doesn't get into that with Grendel's mother. Rather, he emphasizes the vengeance aspect, right? You killed my son, so you're going to get my revenge. It's almost like he's agrees with her, right? This is justified. And in fact, I think Beowulf says something to that effect too. He's like, well, she's just taking revenge, so we got to take her out because she's not going to stop. But it's not as if anybody is saying that she's pure evil for this. It's more of a cause-effect type of morality.
And I think if you come at it with an understanding that it is to some degree if Grendel was a complex, and I'm looking at this narrative as almost someone's experience when dealing with certain complexes and their own personal myth, right? So their own uncovering of what makes them them. And if Beowulf is that kind of telic nature of the healing process of the unconscious, Hrothgar, the ego, recognizing something needs to change, having dealt with this complex for so long. So it's not just a conscious understanding that something's wrong. It's just like, yeah, no, there is something wrong. There's a telic and healing nature of the psyche, i.e. Beowulf. Once the initial complex or a complex is understood, then there might be more something deep structure that is at work, right? And I think that's why with just a general understanding of adaptedness of individuals, you can say, yes, this is potentially adaptive in the moment in order for that person to survive whatever it is they're trying to survive. So qualifying it as negative wouldn't necessarily do them the most benefit, because listen, it might have been something that was beneficial for them at some point, right? So in this poem, in this narrative, that which was potentially at one point adaptive spawned more adaptations, more complexes, right? And gave the individual an ability to, at the very least, have some level of stability. But once Grendel is gone, right? Once that complex is there's a new resolution there. It's understanding, it's an integration. That deep structure complex might be bubbling up to the surface and saying, we're not done yet.
No, we're not done yet. That's right. And there's a whole lot more work to be done. Yep. And the origin of it being all of these creatures are from Cain suggests that the origin of this it's about social instincts, about the connection between me and my surround. And the poet does talk about how people have spoken about these figures roaming the fens and the marshes. There's a shadowy figure, one of Grendel and one of a feminine shape, and that's their whole social connection. It's disconnected. So even though the counter complex, the heroic ego of Beowulf is able to handle Grendel, that's a surface level It's no small feat. The poem makes sure that we know that is worthy work.
Yeah.
But you've got deeper stuff going on, and it's all, as soon as you deal with that. Grendel's mother never showed up until Grendel was defeated.
Yeah.
She would have been there she's there in potential the whole time. And if the anima is about attachment, affection, belonging, connectedness, drawing you into adventure and bliss and possible destruction and all that sort of stuff, then that's about our attachment to others as a whole. See, and at the deeper level.
Yeah.
The deeper level. So killing Grendel then triggered this deeper thing to show up.
Yeah.
That's what the argument of the poem is. And it's very apt. Psychologically, you definitely can see this. I saw this. I had a patient with severe bulimia. And once we were able to get her to recognize the pain that was causing the bulimic behaviors, her relationship began to show the dark side, the underbelly that had led to their long-term relationship that they'd had. It was, there was codependency going on, and one partner, my patient, was maturing and the other one was refusing to engage. So it led to a split. And I didn't like that, but I mean, that was the consequence. And this is exactly the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
She was fighting off Grendel, and once she defeated him, this deeper issue popped up, and then she had to wrestle with that, which was more difficult. And she managed to get through that. But that's an example of this.
Yeah. I think you pointed out it being very social, right? In terms of like negative relating socially. And I think that's really important. It's very Lyrian there. And then the negative mother complex being behind the subsequent, right? I mean, like, and I see the entirety of Hrothgar's kingdom, right? If this is an individual, this is somebody who has been negatively relating. And the psyche is now pretty much saying, you can't do this anymore. So there is a catabasis, right? There's a leveling out for this person because it's not a conscious decision. Beowulf came on his own accord, right? It wasn't as if Hrothgar was putting out, messages, hey, help me. No, it wasn't any of that. It was the healing part of the psyche that was pretty much saying, we got to do something about this.
Yeah.
So you really have that combination between an unconscious telic healing, conscious recognition, a recognition of certain, I would say, more surface level, right? More, they're closer to consciousness, those complexes. And then once you recognize those, you get a resolution of that. In terms of self-development, yeah, there might be something deeper. And I see this with, it's funny you brought it up in terms of relationships, but I see this in relationships all the time, whereas there's a parental transference onto the other due to a parental complex.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah.
And once somebody really starts understanding that, they say, wow, like I've been looking through this lens for so long. And it's equal parts revealing and there is some real level of resolution and kind of confidence in that individual, but also a sense of, wow, I've been doing this for so long. Like, like there's this, I can't believe this in a way, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think Grendel's mother is a perfect image for that.
And that's why the poet says understanding is best.
Yeah.
All the strife and that you're going to go through, the best thing you can do is try to understand what's happened to you. And you do that through telling the stories and, braving the challenges.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So then Beowulf, Hrothgar is overwhelmed with grief, right? And what does Beowulf do? He walks up and he says, my lord, seeking vengeance is far preferable than mourning overmuch. So let's go deal with this. That's like the most Beowulf thing anybody could say. Let's go out and do something, right? So that's what they do. Of course, that is an acceptable outlet in that world. And I have seen that reflected in cross-culturally, that idea. In cultures where there's a lot of warfare, they will use battle and war and killing as a way to manage grief. Yeah. So obviously it's not an option we have so much, because that would be mass chaos. But there was a tribe I read about called the Ilongot. It's a Southeast Asian tribe, completely unrelated to the Germanic tribes. And their belief was that if you lost someone close to you, you should go on a raid and chop off an enemy's head, take it back, so that you could use it in a ritual to throw away the head along with your grief.
I love that. That's great.
I mean, that's metal AF, right? Those guys don't play around, so that's how they deal with it. So it's an idea. Probably won't catch on here.
No,
probably not. But there it is. But the point of bringing it up, though, is just to show the connection between those grieving feelings and that energy. It's just raging, and way that we try to find outlets for it. So anyway, he agrees, and so they go on, and we're going after Grendel's mother now. They arrive at Grendel's Mere, which is described in horrifying terms. It's just the scariest place you can think of. It's a joyless wood, right? I'll read from the poem. The water beneath was stirred with blood. To every Dane it was a wound mine deep, cold grief for each of the Scylding nobles. Many thanes sorrow when they discovered Ashura's head sitting on the cliff beside the water. I mean, that's just rude. Like, here's his head, right? F you, Hrothgar. Here's the head of your buddy, right? Now, commentators have noticed that this description matches something called the Blickling homily, which is a description, a Christian description of hell. So this is one of the reasons why commentators think that the poet was at least knowledgeable about Christianity, if not a Christian himself. He was very knowledgeable about it, because there's echoes of that, of St. Augustine's description of hell in this description here, centuries later. St. Augustine was 4th century. So now, what does that mean? Well, to me, it means that, again, a lot of commentators like to jump on that and say that Beowulf is purely a Christian expression. And I'm like, okay, but if that's the case, then why did he deliberately, obviously, remove all the Christian elements of it and just leave the description of it as Grendel's Mere, right? So that seemed like a pretty deliberate decision to do that. And I think it wasn't so much that he was Christian or pagan, but that he was both, that he wanted to appeal to all the audiences that he could. So he universalized it. Yeah. He made it accessible to both. In his day, when there was a lot of that going on, there was a lot of Christian versus pagan stuff going on, sometimes at the point of a sword. But he was canny enough to say, well, but there's still going to be people out there that connect more with that imagery if it's de-Christianized, so that's what he did. Interesting enough. And that's what the Mere of Grendel's mother looks like, the most horrifying place. And guess where Beowulf then needs to go? He's got to take a plunge. So now this is a part of the poem I think is super important. It's in the middle of the poem. It's the midpoint, which a lot of storytelling gurus out there say you need to have a really powerful midpoint for your story, right? And the poet apparently knew this way back in the old days. And so he does it. And there's this point at which Beowulf is right at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump in after Grendel's mother on her home turf, after she's shown that she's smart enough to outgun everybody around her, even though she's not maybe as strong as Grendel was. She's just as deadly, if not more so. And you get 30 lines of poetry describing Beowulf standing at the brink and putting on his war gear. Why? What do you think? What does this mean psychologically, do you think?
Well, it's having to. I don't recommend this for everybody, right? So I'll put this out there, right?
Okay.
I think that for a lot of people in therapy, they have to just go. There needs to be this kind of the therapist being a proponent of that healing part of them that wants to continue on and move forward, right? I think this is an example where uncovering more is really going to benefit someone, right? Where you have to go that level deeper in order to truly understand what has been going on and then move forward. But I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. I think that in of itself is moving forward, right, so to speak.
Oh,
but you could call this more of a internal investigation, so to speak. Beowulf really having to prepare for something that might be it's clearly more dangerous, right? This is I think this is more of an example of a more conscious realization of what's happening. It's almost like establishing more boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And not letting that whatever this mother complex, this negative anima, whatever you want to call it, not letting it permeate even further, right?
Right. Well, remember, he didn't go through all of this rigmarole with Grendel.
Right. Yeah.
He took off his armor. He put aside his weapons.
Yeah.
And now we're going through 30 lines of him putting on the war gear, the helmet, the mail shirt that was made by Wayland the Smith, right? A legendary smith. This is not just any armor, right? This is awesome armor. Giants made this armor, you know. And he has this mighty blade, Hrunting, which guess who gives him that sword? Unferth, of all people. You know, the poet praises the sword. And I love this line. It was not the first time it had to perform a work of great courage. That's such a great way to describe things. I love that. So he stands there, and the way I see this is when I'm doing therapy with folks, and in my own therapy, there were times when I was at the brink there, contemplating whether or not I really wanted to get into this stuff, the stuff that was being brought up. And obviously it was very commonly relational. It was Grendels Mother's type stuff, right? So the thing is that the poet argues there's nothing for it. You've got to dive in there. There is no other way. But that doesn't mean that he thinks it's easy. He doesn't make this seem like Beowulf just says, this is no problem, problem solved. You know, even as mighty as he is, he's got to work himself up into this. So the psychological realism here is just right on point, I think, because the poet recognizes that diving into a place that looks like that is just not something a normal person would, you know, tend to do without a really good reason. But he says the way that you can do it, the way you can summon up the courage, he gives us a prescription for summoning up your courage. The war gear is a symbol of the network, right? And in fact, the male shirt is seen as a network. It's described in that particular terminology sometimes. And it was made by others. So it's right. So it's saying, I'm going to rely on my connections to help me get through this. That which has brought me to this place where I'm at now. These weapons that come from outside me. See, unlike the battle with Grendel, when it was just me.
Yeah.
Mano a mano, my muscle against your muscle. That is not going to work this time. Beowulf instinctively knows this. So everybody else is like, I ain't going in there, right? But Beowulf says, all right, then I've got to do it. I'm the man for, you know, of the hour, so I got to do this. So the poet describes this, the exchange between Unferth and Beowulf, right? And it's so fitting that Unferth just happens to be here, right? Because why? Well, because we saw him in direct contrast before criticizing him. So that inner voice that says, you can't do this. Now it says, clever and strong could hardly have thought of his earlier words, spoken while drinking, right? As he gave that weapon to the better swordsman, speaking of Unferth here. Unferth himself did not dare risk his life under clashing waves to test his courage. He lost fame for that, his name for valor. It was not so with Beowulf. Again, he shows us how badass he is by saying what he isn't doing. I love that. So it's saying, you know, he is now the exact opposite of what he was before. Unferth is. So I'm going to help you out here because I don't want to do this. I know you're the better man. I'm proving it to you by handing this awesome blade that's never seen defeat before in battle. That's no small thing to do.
Yeah.
Who wants to give that up, right? That's a great thing, right? But I'm going to give it to Beowulf. Okay. So that's a concrete signal that says you're the better warrior here.
Yeah.
Now, there's one more thing Beowulf does before he dives in, and it's basically gives himself a pep talk. Because he goes through several lines, which I'll read here in a second, and then he just immediately dies. He doesn't even wait for anyone to react to what he's saying. So it's as if he's saying it to himself. Right? So he says, if I lose my life while at work on your cause, talking to Hrothgar, you will still be to me as a father always. It's that father connection, see? Be shield and protector of my young men here, close battle comrades, right? So keep an eye on my buds. If this fight claims me and also the treasures which you have given me, then send them back to Helac, that's his king, the lord of the Geats. And be sure that Unferth, that well-known man, he's so nice here, has my family treasure, the wonderful wave sword hardened sharp edge with Hrunting. Hardened with sharp edge, sorry. Then the last thing he says, with Hrunting, I will find a deserving fame, or death will take me. So again, we're back to this fake boastfulness. It's not a boast. It's a statement of, he's basically proclaiming what he will do to build himself up into doing it. Right? It's very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful. And it's not an idle boast. It's not a prediction of the future. It's just saying, I might lose. I might die. I'm going to give it everything I got. And then that's enough.
Yeah.
That is enough. You can't do more than that. So that's the absolute limit is what is given here. Now, here's an interesting thing about this prediction. Every one of these predictions that Beowulf makes before he fights a monster winds up false in some measure. When he was fighting Grendel, he says, I will slay Grendel in this hall, or I will be defeated. And Grendel rips himself in half and runs off. So he doesn't kill him in the hall, actually. He dies out in the mirror. Here he says, I will find victory with Hrunting, or I will die. And neither one happens. He actually can't use Hrunting. It's as great of a sword as it is, it doesn't work on her. And he kills her with the giant's blade. And then later on, he says, I will defeat the dragon, or the dragon will take me. I will defeat the dragon alone, or the dragon will kill me. And he doesn't defeat the dragon alone. He does die, and he does kill the dragon, but with help. Mm-hmm. So the point of that, I think, again, I firmly believe this was a conscious decision by the poet to do that, to have Beowulf go through the trouble of making this prediction and then subvert that by having not that happen. Before I think, I'll share what I think the reasoning is there, but I was wondering what your thoughts are. Why would the poet do that, do you think?
I think that there's a tendency for us to kind of divide and say, okay, it's either this or that. And I think that's wrong. I think in true instinctual expression and adaptiveness, it's that we can go in with certain expectations, but anything could really happen. And I think following that through line, it's just like, no, in moments we're going to have to adapt, and that either or isn't necessarily the case. Now, granted, I think Beowulf, in terms of what this story isn't necessarily just, it isn't ego consciousness, right? And I think that's what we do, is that the ego has a tendency to differentiate, and that's completely normal.
That's the job of the ego, yeah.
Right. So it's interesting that he does that to a certain extent, because I think he's both worlds. I think he's that which is healing, and that's which is consciously wanting to heal.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's really what it is. It's that he's separating, but in reality, what is actually happening is that instinctual through line and adaptiveness, that life affirming adaptiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in those moments, he has to differentiate like the way he does. He has to divide it up as best as he can see the outcomes.
Yeah.
And so again, the poem is psychologically very realistic. Mm-hmm. Even though it's dealing with fantastical monsters. Nevertheless, it's consistent with the way that we would behave if those such things were real.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we know they are real, right? They're real in here. They're symbols of things that are extremely real. So he does this because he has to, because on his mind, of course, is, am I going to live through this or not?
Yeah.
And his way of dealing with that fear is, well, I don't know. I might not win. But I'm not going to fail. I'm not going to give in.
Yeah.
I'm not going to flee.
Right.
I'm going to assert myself. And that's the key point is, it is extremely important to give everything you've got to the conflict, but disengage yourself from the outcome, because it's not entirely in your hands, and therefore it's not wise to ponder it and too much.
Yeah.
You don't know if you're going to win or not, but you do know what you're going to put into it, right? That you can control. So it's very stoic from that point of view. All right, so he dives in. They get into a tussle. Beowulf realizes that he can't harm Grendel's mother with hunting, but she can't kill him either because of his mail coat. It's so strong that her knife can't pierce it. So they're at a stalemate, and they fight for hours or days or something ridiculous. I forget what, but it's a long time. And they wind up in her cave, where it's dark, and they're battling. And there's a moment at which it looks like he might lose, like that she's overwhelming him with her uncanny strength. And remember, part of her strength is because she's in her home turf. And the anima draws you out of your comfort zone, and that makes you weaker. So him taking his accoutrements of his home turf are what helped him survive. And again, you're right about boundaries, right? It's a very literal way of depicting a personal ego boundary is a suit of armor. I'll never forget one of this. Now, of course, I'm into fantasy games and medieval stuff and all that, so this isn't terribly surprising. But when I was in therapy, I had a dream about meeting with Freya, the goddess Freya, and I looked over and I saw all of my armor was being melted away. And so I brought that to my therapist, and he was like, "Oh, okay, I know what this is going on here." And I'm like, "What?" You know, but it was about melting away the boundaries that had been too rigid, you know, too strong. So you can probably psychoanalyze more than I really want you to there, but that's okay. I own it up. Own up to all.
Really? How do you feel about that?
How do you feel? Yes, tell me. I'll give you a strudel. So anyway, so he fights. He figure out he can't figure out how to win. He thinks he might die. And what does he do? He keeps fighting anyway. So this is a great example of holding the tension of the opposites that Jung talks about. Sometimes you get stuck and there doesn't seem to be any way out. And the only way, rather than to get continually bouncing back and forth between the opposites, is to hold the tension and keep at it. And eventually the psyche will find a solution that you've been holding out for, the ego, and exactly that happens. It says God draws his attention to the giant's blade on the wall. So he wrestles free, grabs the giant's blade, thwack, cuts her head off, wins. So again, you can go into this and say, well, this is about, this is another element of Christianity and so forth, giving up everything to God. And I can see why somebody might look at it that way, but it's not what happens in the poem.
Yeah.
He doesn't let God solve all his problems. God doesn't even do anything except draw his attention to something. That's it. That's what the poet says God does. Okay. But you know what? That's enough. That's enough. He sees the sword. It's a mighty weapon made by giants, so it's like magical and ancient and all that. And it's strong enough to defeat Grendel. So it's only the weapon you find in the Anima's hall herself, right? Home turf weapons. So you use their tools against them as the only way to win against a negative Anima. That's the lesson of this here. And you won't be able to do it ego-wise. You're going to have to find a solution in there and hope that the self, which is what God is being used to represent, produces a solution that you have to be paying attention to use. If you're not paying attention to it, you won't find it.
Okay.
So what do you think?
So So I agree and I disagree, right? So
Okay.
like, okay, so I agree in terms of like the tension of opposites. I think it is solely a product of consciousness in that regard. And I think that's why Beowulf is that's why you recognize it. I'm going to do this way or this way. Like this is what's going to happen or this is going to happen, right? And I think we can, and like we were talking about earlier, we can preemptively say like, yes, okay, I'm going to strategize as much as I possibly can, but at the core of that experientially is that I have to do this. It's not an either or, it's a yes, I'm going forward, right? So while he's in there, while he's in this battle, and it seems like it's going on forever, or for quite a long time, it's that and I think this is like the kind of the brilliance of it, which is there's a distinct underlying message there. It's that you can preemptively think this, that, and the other in terms of that kind of dichotomy, that dualism, that split. But in actuality, in actual experience, that doesn't exist, right? To the extent that it does, like the adaptability of the unconscious. The unconscious isn't split. The unconscious isn't binary. The unconscious is, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you could qualify it as God in the poem, right? It's like God guided his eyes to the giant sword, right? The unconscious guided his eyes, to that degree.
That's how I see the self. God is being used to represent the self. That's just a classic way that Jung looked at this, and I think it fits really well here.
Yeah,
that the self is sending, drawing attention of the ego to something is how the self operates. It's what dreams are about, right? Dreams don't necessarily tell you what to do. They tell you what's going on, and you got to figure out what to do about it. And the same thing here. There's this giant's blade on the wall over there. Might want to think about that for a second. Don't want to interrupt anything, carry on. Because the self is just the self, right? It's everything, right? So it's, whatever. The ego, of course, is engaged in this life or death battle. It's just tangled up in this conflict. Literally tangled up in the conflict. And this negative anima figure who has drawn him out, in this war between the ego and trying to make sense of this wounded social connection that generates the Grendels Mother and Grendel, the Grendel clan. And again, this is not just me projecting that interpretation onto the poem, because the image of the giant's blade is very specific. It is the tool with which the Grendel clan is defeated. He kills Grendel's mother with it, and then he goes over and finishes off Grendel, chops his head off to make it official, right? Because this was a Celto-Germanic warrior culture that believed that the head contained the soul. That's embedded in a lot of their mythology there. Nevertheless, it's the imagery that happens afterward, I think, is what connects it to the social rejection bit. And it's because it's fire and ice. The blade itself, once it strikes them, the Grendels, it melts. Because the sword mixes with the rage and the bitterness and the venom of the Grendels. And they then basically just cancel each other out. They're gone. So the sword is just as much a symbol of the Grendels as the Grendels are. See, the root of both of them is the freezing cold of rejection and isolation. And I talk about this in Neurobiology of the Gods. The imagery of cold to represent social rejection is archetypal, it's universal. It's because the brain connects the two. Our social attachment neural mechanisms and the Pangsepian instincts evolved from our temperature regulation mechanisms. So they're connected that way. So it's a very easy connection that anybody can make. Again, it doesn't take a unique poetic genius like this guy to come up with that that metaphorical equation. See? So once he gets in there and he figures it out, the conflict washes away and light enters in the cave, right? So insight, literally, floods the cave. You might think, like, this is a cave that was like way under, like, for one thing, he was diving down for like hours, like a full day of diving down. Then he finds his cave, which is dry, I don't know how that works. Fights this monster, and then boom, light comes in. So we're completely outside of the realm of realistic depictions and in the realm of psychologically realistic in terms of images. So we're in the dream world. And the dream world is still realistic, it just uses metaphors to depict internal dynamics. And like we were saying last time, right, and the monster battles are in this dreamlike atmosphere. And then you wake up and you're back to where you were. This is the same thing. Same thing here.
The solution is found within the problem.
Yes.
The solution in the kind of, it is this disintegration of the wound, right? When you were first describing Grendel's mirror, Grendel's mother's mirror, right? It sounded like an open wound. It sounded like that description. It sounded like, it was
right. It does.
That was festering, right? That just needed some attention. And I think that's big, because he goes in there. I think we all do, to a certain extent. We go in there with certain expectations, with certain kind of these cognitive understandings of the situation, but in reality, this is an unconscious resolution, right? The healing has to happen with some sort of conscious recognition that there's a problem, but then the real work therein is happening unconsciously. I think it's great, and it's something that I've been fortunate enough to be taught and to have conversations about has been that, the unconscious, when you're dreaming, it's doing its own thing, right? Your unconscious is really just kind of going. It's homeostatic in nature,
working on solutions,
right.
And the ego gets a piece of this, is only one piece of this greater puzzle.
Oh yeah.
And so we're seeing this through Beowulf's eyes, but it's in the same vein as what you're saying, right? This is the wound resolving itself with the ego's help. So that's why this whole Beowulf and God fixing everything is so important, that it's maintained throughout here. It's never either just the ego, and it's never just God.
Mm-hmm.
It's always both working in concert to achieve victory. Right. And so that's the thing here. So all of the strife and the mayhem and the chaos, it's primarily from Beowulf's point of view, which is how we experience it as egos.
Yeah.
But like you said, solution is found within the problem.
Yeah.
Literally in this situation. And I love the way you pointed out the description of Grendel's mirror is like a festering wound.
Yeah.
I had not noticed that before, but you're absolutely right. It's boiling blood.
Yeah.
And squirming serpents writhing around.
As soon as you said that, I thought of a scene from Gladiator when he gets his arm cut, and then there's maggots, right? And like that, it sounded like a festering wound, and and that imagery, it's very significant, because I feel like for a lot of people, that's what these kind of these complexes feel like, or something, things that are unresolved, things that they've been living through and not healing with.
Well, it is a psychic wound.
Yeah.
And I often have to reiterate again, the symbols here have real power and reality to them. They're not just airy metaphors or literary flourishes. No. Social pain, when we feel the pain of rejection, it uses the same neural pathways as physical pain, right? So in our evolution, we basically we evolved from animals that had pain sensors, because no pain sensors equals death, right? You've got to be able to sense damage and danger, right? Fear and pain. Well, then we evolved into social animals, and nature always uses what's already there. It doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. It ain't gonna. So what was already there? Pain. So, okay, if my survival is dependent on cooperation, then being rejected by others I need to make it feel painful. So it does, which is why opiates can make you feel soothing to physical or to emotional rejection. It's the same mechanisms neurologically. So saying that this situation is like a wound has maybe much more weight than you might think initially, because it kind of literally, not literally, but I mean, it's very, very much, it is a wound. that is in pain, that is screaming out damage, and it's telling you that if you don't fix it, you're hosed.
Yeah.
You're in trouble.
You're going to continue to propagate, or it's going to continue to do what it's been doing. And it is essential that you give it your attention,
and it's going to fester.
Yeah.
If you don't.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right. Why else would the poem describe the mirror as blood?
Right.
Boiling blood. Where is blood coming from?
That sounds like
make any sense.
Like inflammation, right?
Yeah.
It is. It's inflammation. It sounds like there's something opening and festering there, that it's like getting a cut on the bottom of your foot and you're not cleaning it properly, right? And you're just kind of limping around. So it's not only, I mean, and I say this because I've experienced this firsthand, right? Like I was on a vacation and I just let this thing just go, and it got worse and worse and worse. And finally, when I decided to give it my attention, it hurt acutely so much more than it ever did when I was actually trying to heal it and trying to help my body heal it. But then it eventually, after that kind of peak of acute pain, there was a kind of a smoothing out. Yeah.
So there's a moment in here before he jumps into the mirror when the Beowulf and the Danes and the Geats both show up. They blow a horn at the mirror, like, "Hey, I'm here." Right? "Behold, for it is me." And so the ego announces itself to this problem and says, "We're going to tangle here. We're going to tussle about this right now." And what happens when they blow the horn? All the serpents and the dragons and the slithering snakes all go bananas. And so that's a really vivid way of depicting screaming pain of this wound. So that's really cool. I like that. And then sort of dies down at that point, and then he jumps in and does his thing. So you can see how much is in all this.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was like, that's exactly right. When you're about to pour like rubbing, like alcohol on a cut, and it's going to hurt, how bad it's going to hurt. And I'm like, I just got to do it. I got to do it. I have to get it over with. I mean,
anticipation of the pain amplifies it.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not kind of trivializing, certain psychological wounds.
No.
But no, as you were talking, also it reminds me of Iron John. Where was the golden ball? Where was that ball? Or where was the key? Sorry, where was the key? It was under the queen's pillow, right?
Yeah.
A lot there. But
yeah.
No, I really
these are things that it's so frequent that people look at it as if it were just randomly thrown in there for the heck of it without any real meaning.
Right.
And that frustrates me because it doesn't take that much to look into it and see that there is a lot of meaning to it, but you have to ascribe to this idea of innate symbolic processing and symbols that anyone could find in their psyche at any point, just by virtue of being human. So if you can't buy into that, then everything does feel meaningless and empty and pointless.
Right.
That's another rabbit hole. So I guess the point of all of this then is the exclamation point at the end of all this is that the giant's blade really kind of holds the key to all of the mayhem. It is the symbol of ancient rejection, right, that would cause this strife. And it is the undoing. The blade itself melts away, and only the handle is left. Now, there's been a lot of folks talking about this. There's a very enigmatic part of the poem because Beowulf and Hrothgar and a number of characters look at this hilt of the blade, and it's inscribed with ancient runes, and they don't understand what's on it. And the poet doesn't tell us what it is. He just says that they had no understanding of the ancient runes on it, and just leaves it like that. Very mysterious. So I thought, well, okay, he's done so much else in here with deliberation and obvious forethought. And this bit about the wound just tells me that they're definitely right. This guy had probably seen some stuff.
Yeah.
And he knows what it's all about, right? But he's able to describe it in a more literary and, fanciful manner, but it's still very in fact, it amplifies the message that he's trying to give. But that whole business of the giant's hilt of the giant's blade containing the ancient runes means that this is, to me, an ancient problem. It goes far beyond an individual person and their individual problems with their own life. This is a primordial problem. And it keys into the problem of connection and how do we connect with others.
Yeah.
And if we don't, the sorrow and agony that we feel and the rage that comes from trying to feed that starving social instinct. And the hunger that Anthony Stevens talks about, father hunger and mother hunger and all that sort of thing. This is like hunger for tribe, for community. That's what this is all about, I think, because those critters came from Cain, who was rejected by God, right? So it's like the primordial experience of rejection and how painful that leads Cain to murder. Okay, so yeah, it's that important to humans. That's because we're not tigers, right? Tigers don't give a damn.
Right.
They don't give a damn about tribes.
Well, and the ego is not supposed to really try to understand everything about
it. The ego can't. That's exactly what the poet is saying. Yeah. You can't understand the full depth of this.
Yeah.
And you just got to manage it, bro.
That part of, or that kind of explanation that Beowulf would be kind of conceptually both a part of conscious recognition that you need to resolve this and an underlying kind of telic health, right? Homeostasis for the psyche. That part of us that is, or in conscious recognition experientially, that we need to get better, and that's unfolding, but truly understanding that part of us that is healing, we're never going to fully understand.
Right.
Ever. Yeah.
We're not going to be able to grasp it in the way that we'd like.
Well, I personally, I'm okay with not knowing. I'm okay.
It's got to be mystery.
I'm okay with knowing that the solution is in the problem. I'm okay with knowing that there's a part of me that knows, right? It's both of those.
Yeah, that's right. It's just not, I don't have it in my full awareness, but it's still in there somewhere in the great cosmic psyche or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we covered a ton.
Part 3. There's
part 3
definitely going to be part 4. There's probably going to be part 5.
Yeah, maybe. We're at least going to have one more where he faces off the dragon.
Great.
Because there's some things to talk about there.
Yes,
definitely.
All right, Dr. G. Again, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right.
All right.
See you later.
See you later.